All right, Ben Pellicani, thanks for coming back on the podcast. You're our first repeat guest, so I appreciate you again taking the time to out of your day to come on and talk a little bit about what we kind of had agreed to talk about. Where what kind of inspired me was a post you had made talking about that little red book, Harvey Penick. Is that the name?
That's correct.
A classic in golf, and that versus kind of Trackman. So. Kind of the evolution of golf instruction, and I'm just very curious to hear more about your take on how things have progressed from maybe more traditional coaching into this world where we have every single data point that you could ever imagine. So if you wouldn't mind, what was that kind of topic that you were speaking on from your perspective? What was it that inspired you to kind of make that point or that presentation to kind of compare and contrast these two different ends of the spectrum?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting evolution, right? So this was a presentation I made to fellow PGA professionals, and part of this conversation was, where are we now? How did we get here? And maybe how's that affecting the information we're getting these days? And so it starts with the idea of just kind of the arc of the PGA professional. So in 1916, the PGA of America became an actual entity. And from there, various things happened, right? At one point, they ran the PGA Tour, and then they broke apart. And then in the sometime in the mid 60s, they started awarding what was called the PGA of America Professional of the Year. So it was the first time an award was given. In the 70s, a merchandise award was starting to be given. And it wasn't until 1986 that the first award for Teacher of the Year was given by the PGA of America. And so I started thinking about a little bit of kind of where we are, or where we started, where we are, and then how's that affecting where we're going. And I think it's really, really interesting. So if you think about the most of the people who taught golf prior to the 80s, they were your head pros or assistant pros. And most head pros of the time were head pros because they loved golf. They wanted to keep playing to some degree, and they had the ability to either tolerate or excel in the people business world. And so that's how they got there. They didn't love the lifestyle of traveling around trying to play on tour, or they just weren't quite good enough to make it, but they loved golf, and that's who taught golf. And obviously there were some people who were better at that and thought more about it, and Mr. Penick I'm using as kind of the symbol of that time. And before, I would say even before the 70s, if you think about golf instruction books, it was always from guys who wrote or who played golf. So Bobby Jones and Harry Vardon wrote a book back in the early 10s, right? And then even Jack Nicklaus wrote a book called Golf My Way. That's how we absorbed a lot of our golf instruction information, was from the local pro. And I know I speak a lot in private golf club terms, but you could just apply this to the golf community of a public facility too. It's just I happen to teach out of a private, so it kind of comes quicker to me in those words. But the idea that most of the people who were teaching golf at that time were players first. They were in the golf business. They were in the business of people in bettering their golf community, because that's how they kept their job. And so that's how we got golf instruction. And then sometime in the late 70s, 80s, Golf Digest specifically, but you could just call it the magazines in general, became a bigger trend. They started pushing this idea of golf instruction. And they actually started Golf Digest schools. So there's this traveling circus of kind that would travel around. And guys like Jim McLean and Chuck Cook and Davis Love Jr. And there's a myriad, Tosky, there's a myriad of names of guys who got their origin in teaching golf, for coaching and teaching within the Golf Digest schools that were traveling around. And then they would eventually settle in an area, right? They would have a family or whatever. They just didn't want to travel all the time. and they started settling. And when they started settling, golf instruction became a thing. And it wasn't until the 80s that it became an actual entity, that you were a golf instructor. You were not someone who worked in the golf shop. You were not someone who would check people in for tee times. You didn't have any merchandising power. You weren't picking out the shirts that were at the club. All you did was teach golf. And I think that started this kind of trend. So really in the last 40 years, we've had this big shift of people whose only sole income was golf instruction. And so because of that, golf instruction started to change. Now, technology started becoming a big part of this, and they're all at the same time. And so these two things fed off each other. People started using video cameras. I've kind of come up with a list, and I would say even this is within the golf instruction world, people's skill sets who are really good at golf or golf instruction don't carry to every subset of golf instruction you can give. So I always use Martin Chuck as a example. Martin Chuck is one of the best people ever at giving a golf school. Could he teach tour players? 100%. He has the knowledge. He has all the information of all the tools that are out there. He could teach tour players. He doesn't teach tour players because he's really, really good at giving golf schools. There are people who are really, really good with beginner ladies. There are people who are really, really good working with tour players. That's a different skill set needed to work with a tour player than a really good junior. Recently, I've kind of chuckled. I have 4 little girls at home. All of a sudden, I've started to teach more 10-year-old girls. Why? I have a 10-year-old girl at home. I think I know how to relate and interact with them better. Right. Therefore, parents are sending more of their daughters to me. Why? Because I have daughters and I know how to do it. Not everyone can teach daughters, right? That's not because they're not really good instructors. And so within that subset, what's really interesting is in the last couple years, we have other instructors coming to be that 40 years ago, we would have never even thought of. There are people who just do data analytics. There are people who are just golf researchers, biomechanics. Right. Think about the specialty teachers. I would love to walk up to Mr. Hogan and say, Mr. Hogan, I'm a short game instructor, or I'm a practice performance coach. I mean, there's some really, really talented people out there who kind of use that as their explanation of what they do. And they're really good at it. I mean, I think Mr. Hogan would have looked at him and said, I don't even know what words you're talking about.
Right.
So I say all of that because that's evolved. And now we have this new world of virtual golf. I have a good friend of mine in the teaching business. I feel old saying this, but I taught him when he was in high school. And he went off to play golf at William & Mary. He's obviously a very bright kid, good college golfer. Got into the college coaching world. I kind of helped him mentor him a little bit through that process. His program got basically money issues with COVID. And because of that, he's like, I'm going to start teaching golf. And there's another buddy of mine. He was starting a big virtual golf world. And I connected those two together. He's been teaching golf for 5 years. I've been teaching golf for 17 years. There's a good chance that he's actually given more lessons than me.
I see.
Recently, he's going to move to teaching to a new facility. So he's taught for 5 years. He's given maybe a handful of in-person lessons. Right. Maybe a handful. His first question to me was, how am I going to fill up 60 minutes? And I said, man, that's a great question. How are you going to fill up 60 minutes? He goes, I only do 3 to 5 minute videos all the time. Sure. That's all I ever do because I've learned to teach virtually. He's going to go work indoors at an indoor studio. So there's a chance that his first 10 years of teaching, he will never give a 60-minute outdoor lesson.
Right.
I mean, think about that. That's really, really different than how Mr. Penick learned to teach golf, right? In the way he got moved into the teaching world. And I say all that because I think it's starting to affect what we're starting to see from this. There's a very high probability that one of the top three people being paid at your club or your facility that you play golf at is the lead instructor. That can create some tension within the golf business, which is also a very interesting new way of navigating this. There's also no need to some degree to be a PGA of America professional to teach, right? You can just say, I'm going to start teaching golf.
Sure. Yeah.
Off you go. What does that mean? Well, that means that we have a pretty large subset of instructors who didn't grow up under the idea of appreciation maybe for what our head pros, mostly our assistants. I mean, our assistants are overworked and undervalued by far in the golf world. I mean, that's one of the reasons I got into teaching. I couldn't do it. Right. What they do. I did it for 2 years and said, I'm out.
Sure.
I can't do that. So maybe that connection back to the golf shop's a little different than it was, 20, 40 years ago. So that's an interesting piece of the puzzle here. And then lastly, with money comes the idea of how are we looking at the information and why are we presenting the information we are. I took this quote from a former Harvard professor. He basically said this. I'm going to paraphrase, but it's pretty close to the actual quote. If you take a data set of 100,000 data points, like a big matrix of numbers, and through looking at those numbers, you learn some things through the patterns of those numbers. His comment was, if your view to those numbers is directly tied to furthering your career, you cannot look unbiasedly at those numbers. And I think that's what we're starting to see in golf instruction. We see things through the idea of, well, here's a data subset. Oh, I can hook my wagon to that. I can separate myself from my, other instructor in town, and I'm going to run down that avenue, which I think is interesting, right? And that's the conversation I think we should start having is what Mr. Penick taught. A lot of it was really good. Yes, some of it has not held up to the science of golf. I get that, and I don't think we should think less of the whole because maybe one or two ideas wasn't quite there.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's kind of where we are.
Interesting. So you had mentioned all these different kind of subsets of experts within golf instruction, a practice performance coach, and different things like that, being a golf school instructor, things like that. Does that even go as far as like short game instructors kind of specializing in that?
Yes.
Putting versus, irons and longer clubs? It's similar to me and myself even, where I'd call myself a golf rehab and performance specialist, which again, it's an avenue of specialization where, there's so much benefit to that, where you get to invest so much more time into the details, get to have conversations with people like yourself, where again, because it's just in my world and I'm creating that world around me, where there is a lot of benefits to that. But at some point, things do come down to set in stone principles. They're human beings at the end of the day, and they're going to respond to certain things. So at some point, especially early treatment plan in my case, we always take people back to there's very specific things that we need to improve on. Orientation at the rib cage and the pelvis, and pulling things back into more of like a neutral position. And that will go for a CrossFitter, for a golfer, for a professional golfer, for an amateur golfer, for a young golfer, for an older golfer, no matter who we are. And this is just basic human mechanics at that point. And then we can get into that specialization and the very nitty-gritties later on in that treatment plan. It almost seems like that same spectrum with Harvey Penick there, where it's almost like that. These are some of the basics. This is how we need to kind of start from, and then we can go into these very nitty-gritty Trackman data points and things like that. But you had kind of pointed out where along the line you can find yourself getting into troublesome issue where you're biasing the things that you're finding and creating an avenue in that respect. So would you say that when it comes to the Harvey's book there, Mr. Penick's book, is that a starting place that everyone should be starting from? Do you have issue, or do you see issue with people starting at looking at spin rates in their first lesson?
Yeah, well, okay, so that maybe two different questions there, because
Sure.
the first time I heard that question, I thought of it more of training new instructors, and then
Sure.
I thought of this from the angle of the student, right? So from the instructor side, I would say that balance matters, and I think this is maybe one of my examples. I read a book, great book. If anyone wants, it's like how I score or something along those lines. But speaks. Raymond Floyd wrote a book about how he goes about golf. It's like, I think it's like how I play golf or how I score or something along those lines. And what was interesting about that book is, in its essence, would go against what we're hearing sometimes from these data analytics guys. I'm going to give this maybe other sport example. I am fortunate enough to teach a very, very good baseball player who has won 2 World Series in the last 4 years. So he won the COVID World Series in 2020. And he finished up there. A week later, he was in my bay hitting golf balls. And he said to me, I said, all right, you got to fill me in here. I said, are you surprised they pulled, it was when the Dodgers played the Rays, are you surprised they pulled Blake Snell? And he goes, well, they kind of do it by analytics. And I said, well, I know that. I said, but what did you think when they pulled him? Mm-hmm. He goes, did you not see me? He goes, that's good. He goes, because I smiled and looked back at our dugout and said we won. He goes, there was no chance I was going to hit Blake Snell. He was dealing. He goes, I don't care what those analytics say. He goes, I know they say he's not very good the third time through the lineup. He goes, there was no chance. Right. He goes, he was flat dealing that day. He goes, as soon as they pulled him, we knew we had him. Analytics play a role. Analytics are good. You shouldn't shy away. Like, I'm not sitting here saying, analytics are a bad thing. I use them all the time. They're part of the story. It's kind of like you hear guys talk about in the data analytics world, take emotion out of the equation. Well, I can't take emotion. I am human, right? Understanding how to leverage, I think, both sides, right? It's the science art debate. It's the reason why you have really, really good coaches. Really, really good coaches know how to balance both. And sure, they're going to have a lean one way or the other. But to sit there and say, oh, you got to be old school. Oh, you got to do. No, at the end of the day, science is science, but we are people. So how do you balance those two things? How do you balance the art with the science, and how do they mesh together to be the best version of the person that you're going to be working with? And I think what we're starting to lose a little bit, because of how a lot of our young instructors are coming to to the teaching world, which is what? Through virtual instruction, through maybe consuming information from people who never actually played golf at the highest level. And I'm not saying I played at the highest level, but I did play Division I college golf, right? Mike Bender played on tour. Cameron McCormick played at Texas Tech and then chased it for a while. There's plenty, Jim McLean played on one of those really good Houston teams. There are guys who played at very high levels. And I'm not taking away how good they are as coaches and teachers. And I'm not saying you have to play at the highest level. But I find it very interesting that a lot of the maybe newer ideas, and some of them are great, and I'm glad those ideas have been put out there, are from guys who didn't actually play golf at the highest level.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm not saying it doesn't hold up. I'm not saying you can't do it to win on golf tournaments. I'm not. I just think that we have to be careful with the balance of everything. Right?
Yeah.
Does it fit all the tests? Maybe not just a test. Does it fit all the tests? Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of what we're going to see. I think that's what we're going to see in the golf world. I mean, Scotty Scheffler is a great example of that. Analytics said you have to hit it really good.
Right.
Agreed. Yeah. Ball striking is the price of admission. Mm-hmm. Right? You have to hit it so hard. You have to hit it so straight. But your short game and putting is what wins golf tournaments. And so what we've learned through analytics is that you can't just do it with short game and putting. You still have to hit it. And I think most of us knew that already, but maybe not. We didn't know what that standard was. Sure. And that's what a lot of this data has done. It's given us a standard, a benchmark of saying we probably have to cover this.
Sure, yeah.
If you can't do this, you probably can't do it. Mm-hmm. But there's also this other side that says, hey, every stat should probably be coupled with another stat. And sometimes we're decoupling statistics to, again, prove a point because it's tied to someone's career. And I'm just saying, let's be careful. That's all. I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm not saying anyone else has the answer. I'm not saying anybody else is wrong. Let's just be careful with what we're coupling together. And I think maybe in your world you could, it's the speed conversation. Speed's great, but if your body can't handle that speed, you're getting hurt.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Right? So which one's right? You got to do the mobility and the stability and the ability to handle that speed, or should you just be speed training? Or ultimately, it's the balance, right? Like, that's right. You got to be able to do both, and I think that's what we're starting to find just a little bit.
I see. What's an example of maybe a metric or a coupling of a couple metrics that if you can think of one that you think is maybe leading astray or getting too far away from maybe base principles? Is there something that you've noticed, a trend that you've noticed?
So I think it's the way the statistic is built. So strokes gained driving to me is in its own right not a fair statistic.
Interesting.
Because there's such a level of measure on how distance impacts it. Let me give this example and use this as our working model. And this played out for me when I was a college coach. So when I was coaching at Lipscomb University, this was my 1 and 2 player. They literally did this. And I asked a stats guy, and they're like, no, that's not how that. You give enough reps. And I'm like, guys, I've seen them for 4 years. This is how they play golf. Take 2 players, good players. They both hit the fairway, and they're both long enough to go for the green in 2. One excels at hitting high lofted long irons. Or I'm sorry, low lofted, but hitting high long irons. He has the ability to hold the green a lot. He hits on, and this is just my example, on all 4 par 5s, he hits every shot to 40 feet. He 3-putts one of those, walks away for the day 3 under. Player B doesn't hit it as high, brings it in a little lower, hits it basically on the collar or just off the green, not a hard chip, chips everyone to 4 feet. He makes 3 out of 4 4-footers. They both walk off par 5s at 3 under. Who has the better strokes gained putting? The guy who hit them all to 4 feet. He lost less shots. Mm-hmm. Now, I could make the argument that 1 3-putt from 40 feet or 1 missed 4-footer, who's the better putter? It's how you want to read the statistic.
Right, yeah.
He's a better putter statistically because he wasn't as good of an iron player.
Right, yeah.
In what data people want to say is like, no, he's not as good of a putter. I'm like, no. He's a better long iron player, therefore he can hold the green. And oh, by the way, most par 5 greens aren't flat. So what's going to happen? He's going to have a lot of 40-footers up and over ridges. Whereas the other kid couldn't hold the green. He's chipping it to 4 feet. But one is said to be a worse putter statistically because of strokes gained putting.
Right.
And I'm looking at it and go, are we sure? Because I gave another example, and I'll give this one quick because it's next week. There's a PGA Tour event in Bermuda, and there's this really good par 5. And anyone who wants to go do the deep dive in the statistics, I gave the example on my Instagram. You just have to scroll back probably a year. It's not very much. I haven't posted a lot in the last year, so look for something that looks Bermuda colors. So there's like a pink and a baby blue and all that stuff going on. There's a par 5, and it's a really interesting statistic analysis of a par 5 because you can lay up before a water hazard, or you can try to hit into the sliver, or you can bust it way right into the rough. And basically what the statistics say is, if you hit driver, you got to hit driver not in the fairway. You basically just have to get up and hit in the rough. Because if you try to hit in the fairway, you have the chance of hitting it in the water. Right. But if you just avoid the water, it makes more sense basically to just go hit in the right rough with driver. But if you have a good short game, it makes way more sense hitting iron short because you're only giving up like 0.1. I'm doing this off the top of my head, and this is dangerous, obviously, but it's like 0.13 shots or something by laying up versus ripping driver into. But if you're really good at short game, if that's your, I call it superpower, if that's your superpower, you should lay up every time. Because you took the water completely out of play, and I call it, and this is not a real metric, it's my made-up metric, I call it strokes gained stress. Just because statistics say you should do this, the stress anxiety level, which then leads to a lot of your world, right? Because if you have tense muscles, you can't turn. If you can't turn, then they blame you, and they really shouldn't have blamed you, but that's what happens. Yeah. And so that's the give and take of statistics, right? Mm-hmm. And just because it says you should get up and rip driver on this par 5, I have proven statistically saying that you could, unless you do this, which then puts it back into the player, which sounds a lot more like the art of playing golf than the science of playing golf. Because someone goes, well, the data analytics say to rip driver. And I would sit there and go, or you could hit iron off this tee box every time and be really good at chipping. Which one would you rather be?
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's why it's a well-designed hole. Golf course architects do that all the time. It's called the delayed challenge. Right. So, are you going to defer the challenge to the short game, or do you want to take on the challenge of the driver? That's why it's a well-designed hole.
Right. Yeah.
Goes back to the baseball analogy. I know what the analytics say, but man, give Dave Roberts credit. He left Blake Train in the game, and he got it done. The analytics probably would have told him to pull him.
Sure. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that again, putting it back into the golfer itself and understanding the actual golfer instead of the average of all golfers. And is those some of the lessons that are talked about in Harvey Penick's book? Are these some of the concepts talked about, or are they more technical in that book?
There are some of these things. I think when you read books that are older, and that would be my big encouragement to young instructors, is read Jack Nicklaus's My Way. I'm not saying it's all going to hold up. The guy won a lot of golf tournaments.
Right.
He talks about how to aim to give yourself the biggest fairway possible. Right. Harvey Penick in his book, in the second thing he wrote is, well, is it a swing shape or a club face issue? That's a phenomenal question. Mm-hmm. So when you look at Trackman numbers, which one do you look at first?
Right.
We now have things to quantify things that he said. And again, if it's Harvey Penick's book, if it's Jack Nicklaus's book, if it's Bobby Jones's book, if it's Harry Vardon's book, these guys won a lot of golf tournaments or had guys winning a lot of golf tournaments. And I think understanding where we've been and saying a lot of this is really good. Yeah, I'm going to take some of it out because it just doesn't hold up through what we've learned right now. And that's okay. I mean, how different is that in your world, right? Like, there are some things where people go, gosh, they were close. If they only knew, they would have added that little move,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Now,
I mean, I think there's a lot of things in the world right now that would be better served if we balanced more,
definitely,
right? Instead of swinging to extremes.
Yeah. The with Harvey's book there, some of those lessons from there, they're absent the opportunity to get precise data like we have now. Would you say the same thing about the golfing machine, the book? That's kind of big in your world. Is that almost like
so
right
so
in the
think
middle?
about the golfing machine. Very, very interesting take. Here's a gentleman who was an engineer by trade. Right? Was not a tour player. And what's interesting is that's part of this evolution, right? This evolution of the people who are now giving the information are no longer people who played golf at the highest level. And I'm not saying guys at the highest level know what they're always doing either. I teach enough of them to know that's not true. But what's interesting, things like the golfing machine, right? Or Trackman as a whole, or things like that, is how you leverage the starting point. What is the object? I think sometimes we get messed up with even what the objective is. I asked someone the other day what a good shot was. And I had a lot of people kind of like scared to say, well, I don't know. Is there a right answer to this? I'm like, isn't that interesting in its own right? So if I don't know what good is and you don't know, or my version of good is different than your version of good, what's the point of golf? Let's even start. Why do you even play golf? Right? That's a really interesting comment. Like, that changes things. Is the objective, and again, not to use too much things like data analytics as the example, but is the objective to maximize the opportunities to make birdies, or is the objective to have the best average score? Is the result of golf linear? Well, at the college level, I would say it is. The player who can shoot 70 a lot is applauded. You go shoot 70 a lot and tell me how long you keep your tour card. Golf results are not linear, meaning go look at the FedEx Cup points. Tell me if it's a linear. It's not. So I gave this example once. These numbers might have changed, so don't come at me if they're off a little bit now, because they keep changing the numbers every year. But there was a point where if you played 30 events in the FedEx Cup era, if you made 3 third-place finishes and missed 27 cuts, that was the same amount of points as 27 made cuts at 30th. Which player's better? They have the same status, potentially the same amount of money. I don't even know. I'd have to go back and look at the money side of that. But let's just say the money's the same. Which player was better? I don't know. Yeah. Would you rather have 3 thirds and 27 missed cuts, or would you rather have 27 30ths and 3 missed cuts? I mean, that's an interesting question, right? So what is the right answer? And I think it all goes back to what we can leverage from everyone who's come before us is a lot of that's been at least thought about, fleshed out to some degree. At least there's some opinions that you can see which one makes more sense to you. But at the end of the day, what level you play golf at is going to value different things.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that, again, I'm just asking the question. I don't think enough people are asking the question of, well, why is that right? Or what is the domino effect that goes down? Here's maybe something to end this on. I call it the 9-ball test. This is my 9-ball test. You can put any swing theory through this 9-ball test. And I think if it holds up, I think there's something there. Here's my 9-ball test. 3 different tee heights. So driver off the deck, low tee, normal tee. I am aware that those ball flights vertically will be different. It's very hard to hit driver off the deck out of the proper window. half swing, 3/4 swing, full swing. Can you get your ball to have similar ball flights? And what I mean by that is similar start windows with similar curves. I get it. The one off the deck's not going to go very high. The half shots, not going to stay in the air very long. I know that. But can you do all 9 of those shots with whatever swing theory you want to do? If the answer is yes, I think you got something. If the answer is no, why? And is it valuable enough, and does it matter? And do I need to be able to do it? I mean, I had a young man yesterday here, good junior golfer, one of the better ones in his class here in the state of Tennessee. Mm-hmm. I had him hitting, he hits 9-iron 150 yards because all these kids hit it a country mile. I had him hitting soft, floaty, 120-yard 9-irons. I can tell you, that's not going to light up a Trackman.
Sure.
But it proved a point of, if you can do it at that speed, then we can still do it at 150 yards. And then there's the question of how do you train, and random practice versus block practice, right, and all of those things, right? But again, that's very much under I would say more of the umbrella of, and I'm using Mr. Penick's Little Red Book as a symbol, right?
Sure,
this
yep.
Old school golf. I'm using it as like an umbrella symbol. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is that there's value there. Let's not forget that value. I'm a big believer in, I do a lot of work for inside 100-yard wedge shots. And I can tell you all the 3D Trackman numbers you want. I got it all. We can have that conversation as much as people want. Most of the time I teach people to hit wedges the way I learned to hit wedges, which is I take them over to a pile of dirt where a very nice man named Jim Kardash from PGA Professional in Maryland taught me how to hit wedges. He took a ball, he dropped it on dirt and said, hit me a 60-yard wedge shot that one hop spins and holds the green. And he bet me $20 that I couldn't do it within the summer. And that's how I learned.
I see.
And I can tell you, the Trackman numbers, I light them up when that happens. And so who was right? Is Sir going after a Trackman number, or the way Mr. Kardash taught me how to hit a wedge?
Yeah.
I would argue there's a place for both.
Sure.
And understanding the value of both, I think, is really important.
Yeah, it's kind of the juxtaposition between immediate, detailed feedback and just basically outcome based feedback. And that's what you grew up with, was just all you had was an outcome, and you made whatever changes you thought you needed to do to get to that outcome. With Trackman, you have every single bit of the details of that swing, and you can say, do I adjust purely off the outcome, or do I adjust purely off the details of the swing itself? And yeah, the fact
so take the comment you just made and with the comment that Rory just made, right? Wanted to make a swing change. I went inside and hit balls into a net for 2 weeks. Well, that's really interesting.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? Is there a place for that? I think there is.
Yeah.
I think there's a place for that just as much as I'd say there are times where I'd probably say, Rory, I don't want you to look at a Trackman number. You're a good player. What's the ball doing? What do you want it to do? How would you do it?
Right.
So that balance of those two are really, and if you listen to him, that's kind of what he said, right? He's like, look, I needed to make a change, so I went and worked on a change. And then I came out and I started moving the ball around and doing these things. And I think that's a really interesting comment he made.
Yeah.
How does that balance out between other people? Well, what works for Rory might not work for you. And why did it work for Rory? Or maybe we'll find out that it doesn't.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with what he did. I'm just saying, I think it's a very interesting conversation with all the tools we have. Things like sports box and pressure plates, 3D analysis, this. I mean, there's a massive thing coming that I think is going to be fascinating. There's going to be a pressure sensor in grips here soon. It will really change the way people view how we hinge, unhinge, or release the club, whatever term people like to use. Yeah. It's going to be amazing, right? It's going to give us so much insight. But how does that balance with things that we would have learned, right, through the symbol that is Mr. Penick's little red book?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, we've found so many more ways to create data, and then now we're in the phase of learning how to rightly interpret it and effectively interpret it. So yeah, I appreciate that that contrast that you're kind of bringing, and I really do appreciate you bringing it onto the podcast as well and sharing that with everyone. Again, it's kind of from a golf instructor's perspective, but I think any golfer finds that whole world of stuff just to be fascinating. So yeah, I just have to say, you had made a comment earlier about someone that you're working with in the MLB winning 2 World Series. I'm a Yankees fan, so I kind of had made a bit of a face there. I just wanted to address that I'm still recovering from that disgusting display.
Yeah, I mean, baseball. It was a tough one for Yankees fans, that's for sure. But I grew up a Red Sox fan, so I had my comings for long enough.
Fair
so,
enough.
It's the interesting thing about the World Series, and I think there is a golf tie to this, which is someone said they did a lot of the little things well. And I one of my favorite phrases is what we call beast mode, which stands for be excellent at simple things. And I think in the world of what we just talked about, right, all of those things we just did, that basic fundamentals, and fundamentals doesn't always, and I know we all wanted as golf people, oh, you mean stance, grip? I'm like, well, no, I'm just even saying, like, how does the club interact with the ground? Or how much loft do you deliver? Or where's the energy going? Like, those are still fundamental things. And though some of them deeper layers, obviously, and more complicated, but they're still fundamental things. And I think that's what we can use from other sports, is that fundamental things are ultimately, what I call, being excellent at simple things, are the things that a lot of times elevate people to win championships. And it's, obviously talent plays a huge role, and talent trumps a lot of things. But when you get a lot of talented people together, it's usually the ones who can do the simple things really well. And Scotty Scheffler does that. That's why he's winning a lot of golf tournaments right now. It's what Xander Schauffele figured out. And maybe Xander would be the argument against what I just said, right? Because really, he was good, but it wasn't until he got like 4 more miles per hour, 5 more miles per hour of clubhead speed that he made that final jump. So that's someone who did a lot of those other things well, and then, through the use of technology, figured out how to get a little bit more, and that pushed him from being good to being, well, I shouldn't say great, to being elite.
Sure. Yeah.
And he was a great player. How many weeks inside the top 10 in the world? He became elite when he went and found 10 miles per hour or 10 miles per hour ball speed. So that's someone who I thought leveraged more old school. And Scotty Scheffler, same way, right? Very old school minded, grew up with a lot of short game games around, just playing golf. He was one of those guys. Yeah. And then he leveraged some things we've learned now, and now he's obviously, beyond elite. He's world number 1 for a reason. So the balance of the two and where do you start is a really interesting conversation. And I think it's one that we need to be asking every once in a while. Too often we hear things and we forget the why, and we're just doing the what, and maybe we lose sight of it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate there's coaches like you out there that are trying to figure that all out and coming up with the correct way of balancing things, or at least addressing that balance. So again, I appreciate you bringing that info to myself and the listeners and the people that we're going to share it with.
Yeah, and I look forward to, I think this is one of the cool things. One of the cool things of social media is doing stuff like this, right? Is you came to me with saying, hey, I saw this, and most of the time it would have been for those to the group I gave out in Chattanooga. And now we get to, hopefully people start asking these questions, and I'd love to interact more through your channel, and obviously they can reach out to me directly. But I look forward to kind of people asking some questions and what do these things mean, because I think it's really important that we do that from time to time.
Perfect. What day do you on Instagram do your questions?
Yeah, so Monday. So if you're an Instagram guy or girl, Monday question time is what we call it. I love talking golf. I do it most Mondays. You can ask any question you want. I don't shy away from them. I'll get instructors asking me, in the weeds philosophy questions, to the guy going, I hit a slice. How do I stop doing
Sure,
it?
that's right.
To sometimes I get some just kind of, I get club equipment questions occasionally. If I don't have an answer, I usually direct people to say, hey, I'd probably reach out to this person. I'm not an expert in that. I don't think too highly of myself to say when I don't know something, but I'll direct you to experts. But at the end of the day, I think the more we ask questions, the more we gain ownership of what we know, and that time is just as much for me as it is for everybody else. That's why I do those Monday question times. It helps me better articulate and maybe help some people along the way. And if I can do that, I'm going to try to do that.
Yeah, very good. For anyone listening, go and give them a follow and ask some questions on Monday. Let them know you came from the pod. Perfect. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Ben. We'll leave it at that for today, and I'm sure we'll do it again sometime, and we'll cover another topic.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Of course.